Every car brand has chapters they'd rather quietly forget, but those are often the moments that tell the real story. This isn't just a list of bad cars, it's a deep dive into the models that challenged reputations, tested customer loyalty, and in some cases, reshaped the entire industry. Some of these cars weren't failures at all. They were simply caught between ambition, timing, and tough realities. And that's what makes this story so compelling. If you think you know Australian car history, think again. Because what you're about to see might completely change your perspective. Number 11. Holden HD 1965 to 1966. Every brand, no matter how strong, has a year they'd quietly prefer to skip past. For Holden, in the mid-1960s, that year was 1965. By the time the HD arrived, Holden had been the undisputed leader of the Australian car market for nearly 2 decades. Australians had grown up with Holdens. The brand had become part of the national identity, so when the HD came out as the replacement for the well-received A, buyers paid close attention. Period reviews at the time noted that the HD's styling represented a noticeable shift, wider, boxier, with a heavier front end that divided opinion from day one. Where the EH had felt clean and confident, many buyers of the time found the HD's proportions harder to warm to. Sales figures for that period showed Ford making meaningful gains in market share, something that hadn't happened icily for years. It wasn't a collapse, but for a brand used to running away with the numbers, it was a notable shift. Mechanically, the HD was actually a solid car. The 2.9 6-cylinder was dependable, and the new Powerglide automatic option was genuinely appreciated. But in the car business, how a car looks in the showroom matters enormously, and the HD's styling made that a harder conversation than Holden would have liked. The HR that replaced it just 12 months later was a significant styling step forward, and Holden was quickly back on track. Number 10. Holden Torana LC base 4-cylinder models 1969 to 1972. Before anyone comes at me in the comments, the 6-cylinder Toranas, the GTR, the later muscle variants, complete legends. No argument there whatsoever. But here's the thing about the Torana story that often gets left out. The majority of LC Toranas that Australian families actually purchased in that period were the base 4-cylinder models. And some of those early buyers found the experience didn't quite match what the brochure had promised. The base 4-cylinder engine, while adequate for city driving, was modest in output, and at the time, some owner reviews noted it felt underpowered on longer Australian drives and in the heat of summer. Period reports also documented overheating tendencies in some early 4-cylinder examples. Under extended conditions, something that owner clubs and automotive historians have noted when discussing the LC's early production run, rust appeared on some examples sooner than buyers expected, particularly around the lower sills and door bottoms. None of this is to take away from what the Torana eventually became. When Holden dropped in the bigger 6-cylinder, the LC transformed into something genuinely exciting. But those early base model buyers had a different experience, and their story is part of the full Torana history. Number 9. Ford Falcon XK 1962. This is one of the most dramatic turnaround stories in the history of Australian motoring, and it starts with a car that created genuinely difficult years for Ford. When the XK Falcon launched in September 1960, expectations inside Ford Australia were high. Here was a modern, well-proportioned car with a larger engine than Holden, something that could genuinely challenge for market leadership. What became clear in the months that followed was that the XK had been developed primarily for American road conditions. Period reports from the time, and later accounts from Ford's own Australian engineers, documented that the car's front suspension was not well suited to the corrugated gravel roads, outback tracks, and rough conditions that were simply everyday reality for a large portion of Australian buyers. Reliability concerns mounted. Stories circulated among buyers around the country. The nicknames that emerged during that period were not the kind Ford's marketing team would have chosen. Australian car historians have documented the financial pressure this period placed on Ford's local operation, with Detroit closely watching whether the Australian business could be made viable. What's remarkable about this story, though, is what Ford Australia did next. They rebuilt, they re-engineered. They ran one of the most famous durability demonstrations in Australian automotive history to prove the Falcon was a different car. The XK years were genuinely tough, but without them, the legend of the Australian Falcon that came after might never have been forged the way it was. Number 8. Holden Camira JB, 1982 to 1984 of all the entries on this list. The Camira might be the one that leaves the most complex feeling because it started with such genuine ambition. In 1982, Holden was attempting something it had never done before at scale, launching a front-wheel drive family car built on GM's International J-Car platform. It was modern, it was fuel-efficient, it was a real step into a new era for the company. Wheels magazine, one of Australia's most respected automotive publications, named it Car of the Year. But Holden's production facilities had spent decades building rear-wheel drive vehicles. The transition to a completely different architecture created quality, consistency challenges that showed up in early cars coming off the line. At the time, many owners reported problems with the cooling system on some examples. Head gasket concerns were documented across owner communities. Gearbox issues and electrical faults featured in warranty repair records from that period. The 1.6-liter engine, while modern in design, produced 64 kilowatts, and at the time, some reviewers noted this felt modest against competitors in the family car segment. To Holden's credit, they worked through these teething problems. By the mid-to-late Camira years, many of the early concerns had been addressed. But in the car business, first impressions have a long memory, and the early Camira years were a difficult chapter in an otherwise important part of Holden's story. Number 7. Leyland, Austin, Tasman, and Kimberley, 1970 to 1972. Before we get to the big Leyland story later in this list, there was an earlier chapter that set the scene. In 1970, Leyland Australia brought out the Tasman and the Kimberley, a genuine attempt to break into the family car market that Holden and Ford had dominated for so long. The cars were built around a British BMC 1800 body with a locally developed 2.2-liter six-cylinder engine, and the intention was to offer Australian buyers something different. At the time, owner and press accounts noted that the E-Series engine in these cars had reliability concerns that made some buyers cautious. The front-wheel drive layout still relatively uncommon in Australian family cars at that point was unfamiliar to many local mechanics, particularly outside major cities. Against the deeply trusted Holden and Ford nameplates, Leyland found it difficult to build the kind of buyer confidence they needed. The Tasman and Kimberley represent a real moment where you can see a company trying genuinely hard to compete and finding that in the Australian market of that era. Trust was not something you could build quickly. Number 6. Ford Falcon 40, 1962 to 1963. Coming off the difficult XK years, Ford Australia needed the XL to be a clear statement that things had changed. The XL did move things forward. There were styling updates, claimed mechanical improvements, and Ford put genuine marketing effort behind the launch. But period reviews of the time noted that many of the underlying platform concerns from the XK era were still present in the XL. For buyers who had heard about the XK's reputation, the 40 didn't always provide the reassurance they were looking for. At the same time, Holden responded with the EJA car that arrived looking genuinely fresh and modern, backed by years of trust that Holden had built with Australian families. Inventory records and reports from Ford's Broadmeadows facility from that period have been discussed in Australian automotive histories as evidence of a challenging sales environment for the XL. Ford's full recovery came with the XP and then the XR cars that genuinely addressed what Australian drivers needed. The XL sits in history as an important but difficult step along that road. Number 5. Holden Gemini TC 1975 to 1979. This one is genuinely interesting because the Gemini story is more complicated than it first appears, built at the Pagewood plant in New South Wales. The TC Gemini was assembled in Australia, but drew heavily on engineering shared with the Isuzu Gemini from Japan. In city conditions, many buyers found it an affordable and economical option. But over time, some owners raised concerns that have been well documented in Holden historical records. Corrosion around the wheel arches and lower panels was reported by a number of owners, sometimes appearing earlier than expected. Parts availability outside major metropolitan areas could be complicated, given that the mechanical components drew from a supply chain different to what Holden's traditional dealers had been servicing for decades. And for buyers who associated the Holden name with the kind of purpose-designed Australian engineering. that the brand had been known for, the TC's origins raised questions at the time about what direction Holden was heading. It sold in reasonable numbers, and for many city buyers, it did exactly what they needed. But as a chapter in the Holden story, it represented a noticeable shift that some long-term customers found difficult to fully embrace. Number 4. Chrysler Valiant VH Charger. Lower specification. Models 1971 to 1978. Right before this section goes anywhere, let's be absolutely clear about something. The Charger RTE, the E38, the E49 six-pack, those are genuine Australian automotive legends, and if you own one or grew up loving one, that reputation is completely earned. We are not touching those. What we are talking about are the lower specification Charger variants, the base models that made up a significant portion of actual sales. The Charger styling was genuinely extraordinary. That low, wide, fastback shape turned heads from the moment it launched, and it still looks remarkable today. But some buyers who chose the entry-level variants at the time noted that the standard specification, engine and automatic transmission combination, produced a driving experience that felt some distance from what the car's dramatic appearance suggested. Period road tests of base model examples noted that performance was modest for a car presented in a sporty context. The interior, while well-proportioned, felt compact relative to the car's external footprint. Chrysler Australia offered such a wide range of specification levels under the Charger name that the car's identity became somewhat diffuse, and for buyers who bought expecting sports car performance in the base specification, the experience didn't always match the anticipation. The six-packs are legends, full stop. But the full Charger story includes those base model chapters too. Number 3. Ford Falcon XR 1966 to 1968. Early corrosion reports the XR Falcon deserves enormous credit in Australian car history, and that credit is entirely justified. After the difficult years of the early Falcon era, the XR was a genuinely well-engineered car. It was competitive, it looked right, and it gave Ford Australia something to be genuinely proud of. But there is a well-documented footnote in the early XR story that tends to get overlooked when people celebrate the model. A number of early production XR buyers at the time reported corrosion appearing around the front guards, sills, and door bottoms within the first 12 months of ownership. This has been documented in both period owner accounts and in later automotive historical reviews of the model for buyers who had invested in a brand new car and specifically chosen the Falcon because they believed it. Ford had addressed its previous concerns, finding rust appearing that early was, understandably, not what they had hoped for. Ford addressed the corrosion protection processes as production continued, and the XR went on to become an important car in the Falcon story. Those early buyers deserved better from their new cars. And that part of the XR history is worth acknowledging alongside everything the model did well. Number 2. Holden Camira JD 1984 to 1986. Just as Holden was working to rebuild confidence in the Camira nameplate after the JB's early years, the JD brought a new set of complications. Holden introduced a 1.8-liter fuel-injected engine on the JD, a genuine improvement in response to feedback about the JB's power output. But in 1986, the transition to unleaded fuel required engine detuning, and contemporary reports noted a meaningful reduction in output as a result. Owners who had chosen the JD specifically because it felt like an improvement over the underpowered JB found the post-detuning experience less satisfying. Some of the cooling and gearbox concerns documented in the JB era were still present on a number of JD examples. Corrosion remained a concern on some cars at relatively young ages. Automotive historians writing about this period have noted that by the mid-1980s, Japanese alternatives from Toyota and Mitsubishi were increasingly difficult for Australian buyers to overlook, particularly on the question of long-term reliability. The Camira's JD chapter was part of a broader shift in Australian buying patterns that unfolded gradually through the 1980s, a shift that would define the decade ahead for the entire local industry. Number 1. Leyland P76 1973 to 1974. And here we are at the top of the list. The car that almost every serious Australian motoring historian agrees represents the most dramatic story this country's car industry has ever produced. The Leyland P76 arrived in 1973 as one of the most genuinely ambitious Australian cars ever attempted. 7 years of development, around $20 million invested. Styling by Italian designer Giovanni Michelotti, a choice of a 2.6-liter 6 or a 4.4-liter V8 that produced real performance. An interior large enough to fit a full-size suitcase flat in the boot. Wheels magazine awarded it Car of the Year for 1973. 2,000 orders came in during the first week of sales. The ambition was real. The engineering had genuine promise. What the historical record shows is that the production process faced significant challenges from the start. Industrial disputes at the Sydney factory disrupted the manufacturing schedule repeatedly. Component supply fell behind demand. Period accounts, including retrospective analysis by Australian automotive journalists and historians, documented that build consistency varied considerably across the early production run. Some cars were well assembled. Others left the factory with quality concerns that buyers discovered quickly. And in Australia, word travels fast. Then, in late 1973, the global oil crisis arrived. Fuel prices rose sharply across the world. The large Australian family car segment that the P76 had been built to compete in began to contract. Leyland held on for as long as they could. They couldn't hold on long enough. 16 months after launch, production stopped. Around 18,000 cars had been built. Losses of over $50 million were reported. Leyland ceased manufacturing in Australia entirely. A coupe called the 47 had been planned and was close to completion. An updated engine was nearly ready. Neither survived. What makes the P76 story genuinely compelling even now, more than 50 years later, is that the car itself, in its better examples, showed real quality. The V8 was strong and responsive. The interior space was impressive by any standard. The styling was bold and original in a way that still attracts admirers. This was not simply a bad car. It was a car with genuine potential that faced a combination of production challenges, difficult timing, and circumstances that came together in the worst possible way at the worst possible moment. That combination, the ambition, the near miss, and the abrupt end, is exactly what makes the Leyland P76 the most significant and most talked about chapter in the entire history of Australian car manufacturing.